Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Hope we are all joining today slowly but surely. I know it's lunchtime for everyone and you're taking some time away from your lunch to join us today. I know people are going to continue to join this session, so please bear with me for a moment. Yes, it looks like a lot of people are starting to join. Fantastic. Good afternoon. My name is Heather McLeish. For those of you whom I don't know, I am an ex-com member for British Chamber of Commerce and a member of one of our special pillars for responsible business. So on behalf of the Responsible Business Task Force, I'd like to welcome you to today's session. We are absolutely delighted to have such a fantastic speaker, no pressure. Wei Xin is the head of HSBC's Climate Center for Excellence, and also the global head of environmental, social, and governance research. He has a dual role, which involves analysis of climate change and its multi-asset implications, as well as integration of ESG within HSBC's global research. Now, that is all wonderful. And why do we have him here today? I think we could have him here at any time to talk about some pretty amazing things, but timing wise, today we are just a few days before the beginning of COP26. Some people have called it our last hope to reverse the climate crisis. I think that is pretty strong and maybe not strong enough in some ways. We have been asking governments around the world to set ambitious targets for near-term reductions of emissions on the path to net zero by 2050. How is this going to happen? Certainly governments can't do it by themselves. The public sector and the private sector sectors need to work together in order to have some real alignment towards meeting these goals. COP26 is certainly getting a lot of buzz. Right before this session, we were talking about the news that we follow, and it's totally clear that the news recently on anything to do with sustainability has definitely kicked up in the past couple weeks. So if you follow such news, you will realize that you do not have enough time in your day to read everything. With that, we're going to get started briefly, but before we do, we will be accepting questions from the audience. You can please feel free to, on the bottom of your screen, you take a look and you have a Q&A button, and you also have a chat button. So we'll be monitoring both. Please feel free to drop it. Technically, it should be in the Q&A, but I know most people end up using chat too. So whatever you want to do. To ask a question. Towards the end, we might open up for additional questions, and you can feel free to unmute yourself if possible. May not be possible actually with our admins today. So if possible, then you can speak your question out loud, and if not, just in the chat. With that, we have a short session today. We'll be here for another 41 minutes. So I would like to kickstart with Wei Xin himself. So Wei Xin, first of all, thank you so much for taking your time
Pleasure.
today.
Thank you for having me. Delighted.
I know you've had so many different events. Your time is definitely in demand, and I know from this session you're going straight into another press briefing. So briefly, can you tell us what do you do at HSBC, and what is the scope of the work that you cover?
Yes, thank you very much, Heather. I look at everything to do with climate and sustainability from a research angle. That means analyzing the implications of mainly climate change, but also other sustainability issues. So other broader environmental issues, the social issues, so healthcare, gender, pay gap, equality, things like that, as well as governance. And I run a global team at HSBC, and we do that from a research point of view, which means there are multi-asset implications for equities, for fixed income, for economics, and so on and so forth. So our client base tends to be institutional investors as well as corporate clients, and I do believe my research is read quite widely internally as well within HSBC as we try and all move forward on our sustainability journeys.
That's exciting. It certainly sounds like you've got your pretty wide set of responsibilities there. And before we kind of start looking at COP26, I want to ask from your perspective and from your internal corporate perspective, as well as from your client's perspective, has the dialogue shifted a lot around sustainability issues in the past 4 or 5 years or so? Like in your purview, what have you seen? What have you seen changed, or if you've seen anything at all?
I think there's been a massive change. So many years ago, I did equity research covering transportation, so airlines and shipping, and then moved to do pure sustainability in 2006. And I have to say, I started out with what I used to call the X-Files desk, where it was in the basement. Nobody would come and ask me questions. I would be asking people, do you want to hear about this? And then that all changed in the past sort of 5-6 years, I think, ever since the Paris Agreement in 2015. I don't need to cold call anybody anymore. I think that's in reverse. I get a lot of emails and a lot of demand. So that has definitely changed, as I think the awareness in the general public has grown, as investors have been taking this more seriously, and at the same time as regulators have been pushing. So that's been very important in the general rise in interest in sustainability. So that's been an interesting development, and I think we're all on our own ESG or sustainability journeys, and that will take time, depending on the region, depending on the sector, depending on how progressive a company feels it needs to be in order to survive in the 21st century.
You know, I love that you called it the X-Files desk, because I've just never heard anybody put it so perfectly. There was so much misunderstanding, even 5-6 years ago when I came to EY to help build the sustainability advisory practice. It was hysterical because most of the people in the team are deep level sustainability experts, PhDs in deep level areas of research. And everyone outside of our bubble was like, that's cute. They support NGOs and hug trees.
Yeah.
And fast forward today, where EY in and of itself has gone through our own internal journey to get very serious about climate issues and about sustainability in general. And now we have this full turnaround of groups within our own company that have suddenly become much more aware of these issues. And I think it's really positive. I know there's been some criticism in the market that, is ESG and sustainability a fad because more people are talking about it? And I think many people automatically assume if it's popular, then it can't be trusted. So
yes, but there has been a sea change, and that's been encouraging. And I think it's interesting to bring the sort of financial experience with the sustainability experience, rather than be black and white or one or the other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really particularly interesting at this time, as we, again, essentially on the eve of COP26, where we look towards government to fulfill some of the promises that we need. I'm a firm believer that not one end of the markets can do this on its own, not one industry. I mean, certainly financial services has a huge role to play, but the public-private partnership there goes, I think, a really long way. So let's dig right into COP26.
Yes.
So exciting. I told you ahead of this call, I remain hopeful yet skeptical.
Fair enough. Yes, absolutely.
Yes, I do. Set the scene for us. Most people, I think, on this call will be well aware of what COP26 is. Set the scene. Why is COP26 important? Why are we all looking towards it this year?
Okay, so let's wind back to 2009, where we were supposed to have an agreement on climate change. It didn't happen. So that only happened in 2015. So 6 years later, that's a big delay, so to speak. And the Paris Agreement was supposed to be implemented essentially properly from 2021 through till 2030. Now, in October of 2018, one of my favorite things was the IPCC issued its special report on 1.5 degrees of global warming, and that highlighted the urgency. And so that is when 1.5 degrees became a thing. And that's why net zero is so ubiquitous these days. Now, COP26 is about tying up the loose ends from the operational guidelines of the Paris Agreement, known as the Paris rulebook, supposed to have happened in 2018 now, yes, 3 years ago at COP24. And it didn't. So there's lots of things to be tied up that need to be done so that we can be implementing these policies essentially now through till 2030. Now, the whole idea is to say, we need to be on a net zero trajectory by 2030. And that's very, very worrying because the UN keeps issuing these reports. A synthesis report out this week, the UNEP emissions gap report out this week, which says that we're far below where we should be. We should be heading towards 45% emissions reductions by 2030, and we're not. We're about 7, 8, 9%, and that's not very good at all. So that's something that we really need to be working on, and it's the last chance to get on this net zero trajectory, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of those, the report that was issued in October, I think scared the bejesus, I believe, out of some people who are probably new to these conversations, and to others were like, well, yeah, why aren't we there yet? Why aren't we there? Why are we falling short of our emission targets?
It's very, very difficult to implement. Essentially, we need a complete paradigm shift in the way we live in the world. It's not a case of making tweaks here and there. It's not a case of saying, okay, I'm going to just change a little part of my business here. It's a fundamental shift in the economy, a complete change in how we do power, how we do transport, how we do industry, how we live in our buildings and cities, and quite interestingly, how we grow and sustain our livelihoods. So agriculture, very, very important there. And these are big changes that are not easy to implement, nor are they quick to implement. They take time, which means that there's politics involved. There's a lot of inertia from the old traditional industries that may be higher carbon than they ought to be. So a lot of inertia to change, but a lot of urgency, given that we're already seeing the impacts of climate change worldwide in all those extreme events that we see, the storms, floods, droughts. I know that Japan has seen quite a lot of floods in recent years, but it's also the slow onset events that worry me as well. The sea level rises, that lots of islands in Japan and elsewhere in Southeast Asia, but there's things like desertification, biodiversity loss, deforestation that has to be thought of as well.
Yeah, I mean, you've hit on all of those major issues and the reason why it is scary. And I think one of the other reasons perhaps why the sense of urgency is apparently or potentially lacking in some areas is some of these problems are very long-term problems that are hard to see in the day-to-day. So we do see more storms, for example, more large-scale global storms than ever before. We start to see that damage. We also, as humans, have a very, very short attention span and memory. So it seems like after, during those times, we think, oh goodness, that we really need to focus on this, and then we don't, with the exception perhaps if you were in the areas when such things occur. So I think that's a real challenge. Another point that I just wanted to unpack that you mentioned there, which I thought was really good, is the transition to these in these very, very complex systems. We can't just fix energy. We need to kind of fix everything around that, which it just, if you look at a Venn diagram of all of the issues, there's such a huge amount of overlap. And I think one of the transition key points is shifting from the idea, for example, fossil fuels and people that work with fossil fuels and work in these companies, shifting them. And I think it was President Biden that recently did this in the US. They're not villains, they're veterans. And I think that's an interesting cognitive shift, is that we needed this as a huge part of our energy matrix to build up to human society at this point, but we don't need to do it in the same way moving forward because we've seen the negative implications, but don't vilify this. Let's create a transition around that. And I think that's particularly interesting.
That's very, very fair. And it's the technologies are now available to make that transition. And so the investments need to be made now so that they're there in the medium and longer term, so that we don't just fall back on old high carbon emitting technologies.
Yeah, 100%. And to help countries leapfrog over some of the mistakes, which would now be mistakes because they don't need to follow the same exact routes. They weren't mistakes in the past. I missed it. Looking at COP26, excuse me. What are you excited about? What are you excited, or what do you hope that's going to happen?
Excited about lots of things, worried about lots of things too. The three sort of main things that I'm looking out for very, very broadly are the technical details of Article 6 that's been floating around, I think, the media. So I've been reading around a lot on the different parts of Article 6 and how that could play out. It's particularly important because that is what caused COP25 to essentially fail. So that was the one where it was supposed to happen in Chile, and then eventually it happened in Madrid, and the talks broke down because they could not reach any form of agreement on parts of Article 6. So that would be very important for carbon trading markets and cooperative approaches for meeting our climate pledges. So that's one thing to look out for. And then clearly finance is another area to look out for. It's quite worrying, I think, how finance is such an important part of the climate negotiations, but there is no agreed common definition of what climate finance actually is. So those that are giving out climate finance can say, yes, all of this is, and those that are receiving it can say, well, we don't think that counts. And so there's a lot of nuances there that I find very interesting. And then the third, perhaps more obvious point that I'll be excited about watching are all the announcements that are coming. Are they really additional? Are they ambitious? In what way do they work? Not having a climate pledge on its own, but is this an absolute climate pledge? We're going to reduce emissions by X percentage, as opposed to relative to something, relative to your GDP, or relative to, even worse, business as usual, which can be fudged, I can say. So I think looking at how the countries step up will be very interesting. And then outside of the official COP26 process, it's what companies are doing. So all these news stories that you mentioned that we were discussing earlier, many of them are from companies saying, we're going to do this, we're going to bring forward our targets, or we're going to reach net zero earlier, or we're going to move our whole fleet to EVs, or whatever. Lots and lots of things to be excited about, but lots of things to worry me as well.
Indeed, indeed. And just for the audience, in case anybody's not aware of Article 26, it's the piece of the Paris Agreement that promotes the integration and holistic and balanced approach that will help the governments actually implementing their nationally determined contributions, right? It could also Article 6, yeah. It could also establish the foundation for trading, for emissions trading system. Which could lead, actually, and this is something I'm very excited about, a global price on carbon. I think would be super interesting. I'm far more excited about that than a global taxation scheme for big companies. I think that one just boggles the mind to me. So I think from the Article 6 perspective, I think that is really exciting. I'm also very excited about how I'm a little bit concerned with some of the big very, very big and bold ambitions that I've heard put forward, because I'm very curious, being a practitioner myself, as to how do they actually plan on doing this? And I feel like some companies may be riding this wave of excitement. They want to look very good, so they're going to say, "Oh, we're gonna do X," which is all well and good until we realize there may not be a strategy in place. So.
That is correct. One thing I always tell my clients is beware of climate strategies, beware of announcements from companies that are net zero. There's good net zero and there's bad net zero. So it demands more scrutiny, indeed.
It does. And I think one of the things that I would like to see come out is a further dialogue around how we combat greenwashing, to be perfectly fair. I think and this is a completely self-serving comment, I'll admit, because I do work for a company that can provide third-party assurance. But I think that third-party aspect is very important, whether it's a company such as myself or the Big Four or somebody else that is doing this work. I would like to see more proof in the pudding along. Are we actually doing the things that we say we're doing? And then having some real ramifications, negative ramifications for greenwashing, I think would be quite interesting.
That's true. The transparency aspect is very, very important at these climate negotiations. I mean, transparency builds trust, as you say. It's how do we prove or determine that what you say you're going to do, or what you say you have done, you actually have, and can you provide the evidence of that, rather than just claiming it on a piece of paper. And when it comes to emissions reductions, that's very important because I can't see your emissions reductions
Yes.
visibly. I need to see the paperwork and the evidence behind that. So transparency, as you say, and the verification and the assurance is very, very important.
Also makes it a little more real for people as well. It's hard to, exactly as you said, it's hard to see some of the impacts of positive or negative really in the short term. When we talk about climate, we don't talk about weather. Climate is a 30-year aggregate of the weather in an area. It is not what happened this season and last season. And so I think that that time scale can boggle our minds. We need a few more AIs around us. I'm going to combine my next question with a question that was from the audience. The previous COP summits have also been described as the last hope. I think we're constantly thinking that they're the last hope, but this one is the really, really last hope. Why do you think that is? Why are we considering it the last hope?
Now that's fair. It's, well, last hope, clearly that that comes from a little bit of Star Wars there, but and I think we keep getting Star Wars sequels and prequels. But for climate change, it depends what the last hope is. This one's very particular. It's essentially the last chance of getting on a net zero trajectory by 2030. It's not the last hope or last chance to limit warming to 2 degrees, by all means, no. It may not be the last chance to limit 1.5 degrees. It may be more expensive and more technologically difficult to do that, but to be on this net zero trajectory by 2030, essentially where we need to be, have annual emissions decline by 45% on 2010 levels. That's tough because the UN, those aggregators have looked at all the climate pledges in the world, and they say actually we're on track for a 16% rise in emissions by 2030. And so it's kind of worrying. You need to plan for that now. And if we're not planning for that now, when will we plan for it? You can't wait till 2029. It's not going to be done in a year. So it's the last hope in that sense, to get on a net zero trajectory by the year 2030.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's an excellent point. And so then I think this kind of answers my next question, but you might have more color to it. In your opinion, what would a successful COP26 look like? What would be the elements that you would find, then you'd say that was successful?
So yeah, on those 3 points that I'm watching probably most closely, to have some form of progress on Article 6 is very, very important. Now, there are 3 different parts to Article 6. One is the sort of bilateral trading in a wonderful acronym called ITMOs, which stand for Internationally Transferred Mitigation Obligations. Never mind about that, but it's the systems of accounting of how those mitigations can be transferred. So making progress on at least agreement that what activities can count, which countries can actually sell these bilateral credits, which can buy them, and how much. So some form of agreement there for Article 6. And then on the mechanism that is so exciting for you, Heather, is do we have a system or a framework in place to establish what activity is going to be counted there, what prices are, how the accounting works? I think that's very important. That's the big sticking point. How can we avoid double counting, but actually do it in a way that works? And one of my favorite phrases of the past few months has been Article 6.4 Part D, just to get technical, but I love this phrase because it's OMG, the overall mitigation of global emissions. So that's one for Instagram. OMGE. It's about ensuring that the emissions reductions that you make through carbon credits and that could be applied in this mechanism are actually lowering the overall atmospheric concentrations of CO2. It's not just you've made an emissions reduction here and you've allowed one to occur somewhere else. So it's a true reduction. So that's something that I'll be looking out for in terms of the success. On the finance, it is how can developed economies convince the developing economies that they will come good on their promise of $100 billion per year. And there's various numbers floating around about, yes, we almost got there at $80 billion. And then the question is, well, was that for mitigation or adaptation? Most of it was for mitigation, but adaptation is so much more important for the vulnerable economies, the developing economies. And then we'll see what pledges are brought in terms of ambition. On the news this morning, I was seeing that Brazil might bring something. So we'll see. We're expecting some things possibly from other important emitters as well. Disappointing to see India say, no, we won't be bringing a net zero target. So lots of things to be looking out for. I think the success is on a spectrum, really, depending on the perspective you have. Are you a government? Are you a business? Are you civil society? Are you a Swedish teenager? So success will come in various aspects there.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I've said several times to people that I can't wait for all of these governments to stand up and then for Greta to just tear them down. Just remind us that we're not doing that. I'm a massive, massive fan of hers. I think she says the unpopular thing, and that takes courage, very much courage. Really, really fascinating. But I just want to go back to one of the points that you made there, just so we can clear this up for the audience. Adaptation versus mitigation.
Yes.
What are both of those, and why is one getting more attention than the other?
Sure. Adaptation, sorry, let's start with mitigation. Mitigation is essentially reducing emissions. So that's properly understood. People think about climate change and they think we need to reduce our emissions, our carbon emissions and other greenhouse gases, and that will contribute towards solving the problem. And that's fine. And that is a fair assessment of what needs to be done. However, we've come so far in terms of increasing atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide. I mean, what was it? Pre-industrial times, we were about 260 parts per million. I think a safe limit, roughly safe, so that gives us a 2/3 chance of staying within 2 degrees, is 350 parts per million. We breached that in 1988. We're now 413, 14, 15 parts per million. So people get that, but because it's so high, we're already seeing the impacts. So the adaptation aspect is so important. That's about embedding resilience into the systems and the infrastructure that we have in various economies. Now, it's not just physical infrastructure, it's social infrastructure. So it's healthcare systems, IT, monitoring, making sure that farmers can maintain their livelihoods. Now, mitigation gets a lot more attention because it's global. If you were to save or decarbonize, reduce your emissions, that would have an impact globally, and that's wonderful. But if I'm going to make a bridge across my river or my stream in Hong Kong stronger and able to withstand a 1 in 100-year storm, only the people using that bridge benefit. So the impacts are much less visible from that sense. And so there has historically tended to be a much greater focus on mitigation than there have been on adaptation. Although, to be fair, I think it's much more important to certain economies, especially emerging markets.
Yeah, it's a very, very important point. And I think particularly wealthy nations tend to forget their own vulnerable communities. And it's very, very easy as an overall wealthy nation to overlook vulnerable countries. And I think that adaptation piece is exceedingly important, because even if we were to stop all extra carbon into the atmosphere today, it's going to take a very long time for us to repair the damage we've already done and everything that's already in the environment. So I think that adaptation piece, and particularly relevant for all of us who live here in Asia. How hot can we deal with our summers? We have nice age. I'm a big fan of the summer, but even I have to say it's just getting hotter and hotter. I do hate the snow that I had in Massachusetts growing up, but even then you're getting this more extreme weather all the time. And how do we adapt to that? There's a real human element to how we build resilience into our communities, which impacts our businesses. I think one of the old ideas that people used to have is, oh, well, if it's going to get more expensive to do this, we'll just buy more insurance. Well, insurance companies are sitting back trying to figure out, how do they price this risk? And that's a very serious challenge for financial services right now, is trying to understand how do you price that risk, or is it uninsurable? So that becomes, if our homes and businesses can't be insured because of these issues, like it's unfathomable how we can move forward in some ways. So
absolutely, and it comes down to sensitivities as well. You could have the same floods in developed economies, and there's a lot of asset damage. It's very disruptive. People can't get to work, but the loss of life might be quite low. Where if you have the same floods in vulnerable countries, the loss of life can be huge, and the impact on their livelihoods is much, much greater. So it's something that I think needs to be appreciated amongst us who live in industrialized countries.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. So I want to switch to some of your more specific questions here. I have a question here on carbon credits. What are your thoughts on the relative effectiveness and long-term viability of carbon credits? And I can include carbon offsets in there as well. How can we be sure we're buying good carbon credits? What are good carbon credits? Do you see this market expanding? Your thoughts on that would be really helpful.
Okay, I'll answer those questions in reverse, but all to do with carbon credit and offsets. I think there is the notion that we will need to use carbon credits and offsets because everybody is doing net zero. And that is important that we do net zero. But net zero means a balance between your sources and your sinks of emissions. Now, there are natural sinks, so the oceans absorb a lot, forestry and soil, for example, but we do need others that can take that out. Now, one important point about net zero is we should be trying to decarbonize organically. So we're reducing our emissions as much as we possibly can. And then when you cannot do any more, the residual is offset. So that is where the market for carbon credits and offsets should really come from. Now, carbon pricing as a whole is a mechanism designed to nudge behaviors. It's designed to push, encourage, incentivize companies to be more efficient with their carbon, so to speak. So how can we make our processes happen at the same operating output, but by producing less carbon? And that is something that they need to be thinking about. So there is definitely a market and a good use for carbon pricing, so emissions trading through all of that. Now, when it comes to credits and offsets specifically, they need to be verified, I think, very, very well. So very, very good for your organization, for example, Heather, to be involved in that. And it's a case of saying, does it do what it says on the tin? When you say you have absorbed 1 ton of carbon dioxide, how can you prove that? So there are various types of projects that could be classified as carbon offsets, very loosely held as sort of reducing emissions. You say you're going to emit 100 and then you only emit 80, so there's 20 reduced there. There's emissions saved as well. There's withholding emissions. There's a bit of carbon capture and storage there. There's avoided emissions. I'm less of a fan of avoided emissions. I was going to build a coal-fired power plant, but I'm not anymore, so I'm going to build a solar plant, and the emissions avoided from the coal, can I get credits for this? I'm not a fan of that, really. But then there's direct air capture. I am a fan of these carbon dioxide removal technologies. Lots of different ways of doing that. One of the most common ones, or most famous ones probably, is the one in Scandinavia, where they've got a whole bunch of fans sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere and then storing it in other ways. So I think that is credible, but for other projects, so stopping deforestation. How do you know that your credit here that we've given you for stopping deforestation in your forest doesn't mean that the trees across the road have not been cut down? That's hard to verify. And at the same time, how do you know that when you're being given credits for growing your forests, how can you guarantee that that forest is going to be there in 100 years' time, which is how long the carbon dioxide will stay in the atmosphere roughly, and not, I don't know, succumb to a wildfire or a bushfire or an insect infestation, for example. So there's lots of questions around verification that need to be ironed out, I think. And for companies that are looking to buy these offsets, they really need to go to the most credible verifiers to make sure that the projects that they're buying them from are credible and truly additional, to bring in an additional, another climate phrase there, additionality. So it's really or truly beneficial for the climate, and that's very, very difficult to verify.
Oh, I mean, it's such a wonderful opportunity to be part of sustainability at this time. And one of the things I find the most exciting is it's really hard. It's so challenging, and it's changing daily. And I think that's what is understandably exceedingly frustrating for people. We're looking for the one magic standard. We're looking for the one right way to do X, fill in the blank with whichever area of sustainability that applies to you most immediately. And it's really hard, and we're not there yet. We have to continue to get smarter on these things. But I couldn't agree more on, we've mentioned it a couple times already, that verification, the traceability, the transparency around what we're doing. And I think having the professional integrity from a firm perspective to say, this is what we know, this is what we've done to the best of our ability, this is real and true, I think is hugely important. And I think there's going to be even more demand for that moving forward. I want to get to some of our audience questions because we have, I realize we have about 9 minutes left, and I'm already disappointed because I'm already missing you. This is, I could spend a lot longer speaking to you about things. Phil Robertson asks about what would you consider to be the single most compelling piece of scientific evidence that could be used to really calm the skeptics who still, I'm afraid in my country, may still be lingering that climate change is caused by humanity and humanity's activities. What do you think is the most compelling piece of evidence that you've seen?
Oh, thank you for the question. There's a lot. I mean, the single piece of data that I would highlight would just be the temperature rises that we have seen. And these temperature rises may seem small, 1 degree here, 2 degrees there, but actually it's a lot. And I like to tell this to my children that the temperature difference between now and the last ice age was about 5 degrees. And we're talking about the global mean surface temperature of the entire planet. So we've already warmed at 1.09 degrees globally, but we're warming 1.59 degrees on land, and well, most of us live on land, and so it's already causing all these changes. Any way you look at the temperature sets from the Japan Meteorological Agency, the UK Met Office, NASA, Australia, all of the above, I don't think there's a way that you can look at it statistically without saying the temperature has risen. So that is very, very compelling indeed. And then all of the effects happen from there. The temperature rises, more heat energy is trapped, water availability changes because of evaporation, and water ends up going in, falling precipitation-wise in the wrong place at the wrong time. And everything happens from there. And all the extreme events that we're seeing, there's a climate signal in those for sure. So if that's not enough evidence for some people, I don't know what it'll take.
Yeah, I almost, and I'll chat with Phil on this later. I almost didn't take that question because I'm so tired of answering it myself. I think many years ago, I was delighted to speak to the skeptics because it helped me get better at pitching what we're doing. And now I'm like, you know what, if you don't believe it at this point, get off the bus. The bus is moving fast.
It's unequivocal is the word, unequivocal.
Yeah, absolutely. But excellent question. Thank you, Phil. I want to paraphrase a question from Gavin Dixon. And this to me is a really important piece. Some of the things that we're probably going to need to do are going to probably in the short term lose shareholders' money, or perhaps there's going to be a transition period where corporations, for example, are not able to make as much money because they need to invest heavily in areas of the business that are going to help positively support the environment. And hopefully, obviously, the sweet spot is that you're doing good and making money at the same time. But there's going to be a transition period where some things are just not going to work, or you're going to lose money for shareholders. How do you think the investment community can really go from the short-termism that they have today to a longer view? What do you think it's going to take for them to get to the point where they're like, oh no, we're in it for the long haul. We understand these issues, not just in the grand scheme of things, but we understand this is going to impact my portfolio or my pocketbook for a period of time, and I'm comfortable with that. What do you think about that?
That's a tricky question, but no, thank you very much for asking. It is, as you partly answered in the question, it is about focusing on the long term. The structural changes that will happen in the economy may cause a shorter term deflation or lowering of gains and GDP and so on and so forth. But longer term, the infrastructure, the systems, the business model changes, the corporate strategies that we put in place now will hopefully mean that you will have much greater growth in the longer term. Now, what will it take for shareholders to appreciate that? Let's broaden that to stakeholders, so not just shareholders, but our employees, our customers, our tax regulators, our local communities, and there is an overall benefit to all of those stakeholders as opposed to just the immediacy of shareholders. Now, what is happening is that investors themselves are moving along on their ESG journey. And so with the more information that is disclosed, with the more use of that information in investment decisions, there should be a broader realization over the longer term that this company is going to do better. And if you add up all the, so to speak, cash flows going forward from now until this some point in the future, they should be higher than the otherwise would be if you just included the short term without making these changes towards greater sustainability. So it is trying to focus on the longer term, and a greater appreciation of ESG and sustainability in investment decisions should make more shareholders and investors realize that.
I couldn't agree with you more. Paul Pullman, the legendary, Unilever change maker, is now trying to fix capitalism. His new book, Net Positive, which I have not been asked to plug, but I will plug anyway because I find it really interesting, really believes that capitalism isn't the enemy of this problem, but it certainly, we know capitalism is an imperfect system, but much better than the other choices we've come up with. So understanding how we can make these shifts also must take into account the fact that it's very difficult to change. We not only have to change policy, procedure, organizations, we have to change ourselves, the way we're living. If anyone has ever tried to change a bad habit they have, or a habit they have themselves, you know how hard it is to change yourself, never mind trying to change a group of people. So I think that's a real challenge. There's other questions in the chat, but I think I'm going to ask you to give us a final word. Really, we've got a couple minutes left. You've been so generous with your time, and your fantastic ideas and thoughts I think are very much appreciated. So on behalf of the Chamber, I would like to thank you. And before we go, I do want to know, where do we go from here? What are your hopes for not just for COP26? Where do you really see us going past COP26? What do you see that, or what would you like to see from governments, from governments and from businesses moving forward that's going to make the biggest impact for you? What do you want to see?
I would like to see an acceleration in the pace of change. And that occurs everywhere. It's not just in businesses, but it's for investors being more aware. It's for governments and regulators doing the regulating, moving away from just giving some guidance and saying your climate disclosures can be voluntary if you want to, but to making them more of a comply or explain, or even sort of a mandatory. So everyone moving forward, I think, is important. That is what I would like to see. And one thing that's often missed is what we can do as individuals. And I think as individuals, because we are individuals in the public, but we also work at regulators and governments and businesses. But the small differences that we can make are making conscious choices in our everyday lives. Now, conscious choices means thinking about, what are we eating? What are we buying? What transport forms are we actually taking? And that does add up. And if we do that in our daily lives, that can be taken into our, hopefully not too different professional lives, wherever we work, and so on and so forth. And I think those differences will add up, but we really need to be doing it now and not waiting for an impact to shake us up before we wake up, so to speak. So everyone doing their part, and that includes myself and everyone listening. So thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you, Heather.
The pleasure is absolutely mine. Everybody, virtual round of applause. Rachel, thank you so much. We're really excited. We'll be following you on Bloomberg and everywhere else to see who, what you're saying about COP26. On that note, I will end this session. Thank you all for your time. Thank you for the great questions. Should you have any questions further, please shoot them over to us and we can send them along. Wonderful session. Again, have a great day. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
And we're done. Thank you very, very much.
That was fun, Heather. Thank you very much. Excellent.
No,
Hosting, moderating questions. I enjoy that very much. Thank you.
do you know what? It's always so easy to moderate and